Good afternoon, Britain. It is 8 minutes past 1. Now, a legal challenge over whether transgender women can be regarded as female for the purposes of the Equality Act begins today at the UK Supreme Court.
Yes, the case is the latest in a series of challenges brought by the campaign group For Women Scotland over the definition of woman in Scottish legislation, which has tried to mandate 50% female representation on public boards.
Well, let's go to the Supreme Court now and speak to GB News reporter Adam Cherry live from the scene. Adam, what are we hearing today?
Well, we're just hearing the opening submissions from Aidan O'Neill, who is the representative for Women Scotland. He's their barrister, their KC, and he has essentially been outlining the context of this case and why it's important to For Women Scotland. Now, you guys explained before the news bulletins the background to this. It started with a case to do with public boards and whether it should have 50% female representation up in Scotland. And then in 2022, there were further cases where For Women Scotland were defeated and have subsequently appealed, taking it to the Supreme Court today. Now, we've heard from, I'll just read specific quotes from Aidan O'Neill. As I say, he's been the only person really explaining his side so far. And he says that to agree to this is to capitulate rather than to confront patriarchy. So that's a specific part of their argument, that this agreeing with the Gender Recognition Act's definition of womanhood, which is trans women are legally women, it somehow confirms patriarchy. So I hope to speak to representatives about this specifically shortly. If the certification process takes away rights to those things, spaces, jobs, etc., it's capitulating, and when hospital wards have to accept men and exclude women, women lose out. So it's talking about how women are undermined by this act, and it's important to retain a biological legal understanding within the Equality Act, or women are excluded, as you say, from women-only spaces, and there are safeguarding consequences to that. So that has been the focus so far today. As you said, we won't hear a decision today or even tomorrow. It'll be next year. So there's a long time to go through this, but it's really about that perennial question: what is a woman, at least legally speaking? How do we define it, and how do we protect women's spaces, whilst at the same time recognising that some people, trans people, are seeking protection as well? It's a very complicated argument.
For Women Scotland maintain that the language used in the Equality Act is the ordinary definition of sex, so what you or I might understand to be the difference between men or women. So when in the Equality Act it says that you can legally discriminate against men, let's say, in certain circumstances, like to prevent men from competing against women in sport, to prevent men from entering women's safe spaces, toilets, change rooms, etc. For Women Scotland maintain that that is what the Equality Act means. Ordinary definition of sex. But of course the Scottish Government think that it means whether or not you've got this gender recognition certificate. Now, how might the findings of the court later on this year affect the law as it stands?
Well, exactly. If this is ruled in favour of the Scottish Government, then those women's spaces potentially could be influenced, and trans women could be allowed into them, and therefore some women, like J.K. Rowling, who have donated to this campaign, would argue that the women have been undermined. So it's hugely significant. And so it's been going on for several years. So the consequences of it, when it is decided next year, will have an impact not just in Scotland, but in the entirety of the UK. It's very, very important. Hence why it's very busy here today, because people have a huge interest in it, not just those specifically in the campaign, but the broader public as well.
Cherry, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and catch you a little bit later there outside the Supreme Court. I find this very interesting because the Equality Act was passed in 2010. Mm-hmm. The Gender Recognition Act, I think, came for about a decade before
2004.
that point, or 6 years before that point. I suppose the argument is that the Equality Act is a newer piece of legislation, supersedes the older piece of legislation, or at least one of the arguments, perhaps. But I mean, were there any problems in the UK from the years 2004 to 2010? Was this a big issue?
Well, it's a really interesting question. The reason that the Gender Recognition Act was brought was because of a claim in the European courts by a man who wanted to transition to a woman but stay married to his female wife because it was before the Equal Marriage Act.
Right.
So that's why the Gender Recognition Act came in. Now,
Right.
of course, it's obsolete now because you can marry somebody of the same sex, which wasn't the case in 2004. So there are some people who think that we should just repeal the Gender Recognition Act because it no longer has a lawful use. The problem is that the Equality Act is not clear what it means when it refers to sex, because, as you say, in 2010, trans ideology had not hit the mainstream, and it was never
such a
anticipated.
small part
exactly.
and perhaps it was society just muddled along,
Yeah.
really, and that was perhaps the least abrasive, most harmonious position that we've had on this issue, where it wasn't dominating news headlines and people sort of just lived and let live.
That's right, and very, very few people wanted to change gender, and those that did not have a political axe to grind and weren't trying to force themselves into women's spaces for political reasons. But unfortunately, that is where we are now.
Is it?
Absolutely. I mean, of course, there are some people who genuinely want to change gender and live a quiet life, but there is a lot of activists out there who wouldn't even call themselves trans, who are actively trying to reduce women's rights by forcing themselves into women's spaces, which is exactly what's happened in Scotland. And of course, a big part of this argument happened in a rape crisis centre in Edinburgh, where the person they employed to lead the rape crisis centre was a man. That's how J.K. Rowling got involved.
Well, Adam Cherry is now outside the Supreme Court with a guest related to this case. Take it away, Adam.
Hello guys, I'm joined by Susan Smith, who is Director of For Women Scotland. Susan, thanks for joining us live on GB News. What's your thought on what you've heard so far? Your KC has been outlining your argument. Why are we here and why is this important?
It's really important for the ongoing protection and preservation of women-only spaces and services. Our KC set out today some of the issues that could arise if the completely mishmash of definitions of what a woman is or what a man is, as outlined by the Scottish ministers, is adopted, and how in practice that will make the operation of single-sex spaces going forward pretty much impossible. So it's huge risk for women, especially women who are going to be impacted by any changes to these services. And that's pretty much all of us, to be honest.
Now, we won't hear the result of this case until next year. Are you optimistic so far? Of course, very early, and we're yet to hear the argument for the Scottish Government, but what's your feeling so far?
It's very early and I really can't say, but I think one thing that is coming through very clearly from our KC, and actually from the arguments submitted by the EHRC, is that if we lose, it will be a massive headache that Westminster will really have to deal with, because it's a mess. If the Scottish Government's argument stands, we are in Alice in Wonderland territory.
Can I just ask, so how did we get here? Because our presenters were just explaining that it's really a niche piece of legislation in the Scottish Parliament that led us here. Could you just give us a brief outline of the background of this case?
That's right. It was a piece of legislation that sought initially to define women on a self-identification basis. And we challenged that in Scotland and we won. And then the Scottish Government redrafted the definition and included men who had acquired a GRC and thus changing their legal or certified sex to
Gender recognition.
yes, that's correct. And so we've challenged that, and we're bringing it because that definition depends on how you interpret the Equality Act. So if we lose and their definition holds sway, it means that any service potentially throughout the UK will be impacted.
Do you feel that in the last couple of years there's been a change in the public mood on this topic? Do you feel there's more support, less support? I mean, it's such a contentious issue. That's why so many people are here. But what are your thoughts on the public attitude?
I think the public is starting to realise that this is about women's rights, and it's about something that we've fought for a very long time. Our KC was talking today about all the hoops and hurdles women have had to jump through to get equal representation under law, and now we're facing that being rolled back. So I think people have started to realise this isn't about any other group. It's about whether or not as a society we value women.
Now, finally, we haven't heard the representations from the Scottish Government yet, or Amnesty International make an intervention, but they will say that this is about protecting the trans community, which is a very, very small community which often receives, is a sort of persecuted minority. What's your view on that? That's their position. And what would you say?
I would say that group is protected under law as it stands. They have those protections. What they are wanting to do is erode women's protections, and that's not the same thing as claiming protections. We're quite happy for all groups to have protections, but this is as insane as, for example, deciding that the protected characteristic of disability automatically has to include everyone over the age of 60. It takes away rights from people who need it and extends it to people who probably don't need it.
Susan, thank you very much for joining us on GB News. Thank you. Well, there we go, guys. The hearing will continue at about 2 o'clock. We'll be providing live coverage throughout the day, and I'll be back with you just after 2:30 with the latest.
Well, thank you very much, Adam Cherry. Speak to you then.
It will be very interesting to see the impact that the result has. As you said, won't hear it till next year. But if 4 Women Scotland win, essentially it will be settled that for the Equality Act, your sex means your sex. So if you're a woman, you're entitled to be in a space with women only. But if they lose, the government does have a huge headache, because potentially that means that single-sex spaces don't exist anymore, and that won't be acceptable to a large amount of the general public.
Or, if they win, let's not forget who the Prime Minister is. Let's not forget that there are 411 MPs out there elected as the Labour Party. I mean, they've got a massive majority of over 170 in the House of Commons. It could be that if the Scottish Government lose, we see proposals brought forward to amend the Equality Act to then revert it. Because, I mean, 4 Women Scotland are, to some extent, arguing against the status quo here. Well, in terms of what would change if 4 Women in Scotland won this case, is that certain provisions that transgender women feel that they can go to now, they would not be able to go.
Yes,
so that would be the change.
It will give legal cover. So at the moment, people who, let's say, run hospitals are unclear, genuinely unclear what the law means, and so they do fear legal challenge if they, for example, try to say that a trans woman can't be on a female ward. If 4 Women Scotland will win, it will be settled, and they will have the legal backing to say women only means women only. So I think, you know, whether or not you still need legal change, I don't know, but it will certainly give confidence to people running public sector organisations that want to provide single-sex spaces.
Yes, I mean, so I suppose that's an argument. There is also the argument that there will be some vulnerable transgender women who would be at risk going on all-male wards.
Well, that's certainly true, and I think the best accommodation for those people is a private room, because there isn't an in-between space in this. If you're not safe amongst men, but you're not legally allowed to be with women, then a private room. But you see, that also has precedent, because that is providing a service that meets someone's particular needs. So, you know, I don't think that's an impossibility, but it is a really, really important case, and will have significant repercussions, particularly if they lose, because I think the Labour Party is in a very difficult place on this issue, but they can see the way the wind is blowing, and they will have to do something about it.
Yeah, I wonder if the Equality Act as a whole needs some root and branch
or
reform.
The Gender Recognition Act just needs to be repealed now that it's obsolete.
I mean, I just look at some of the protections in the Equality Act. I mean, this is the act that has given ethical vegans the same sort of rights as people who are of different ethnic minorities.
Or have established religious faith. I mean, there's much of it that's absurd. So, I mean, some of it is just putting together a number of different acts that have been there through the ages, or things like, you know, religious discrimination, freedom of speech, but some of it has created new ways of claiming discrimination.
There is such a broad protection. I mean, there are protections that I think most people would think that the Equality Act protects. I mean, whether you're gay or straight, whether you're white or black.
Race, disability.
And then it goes to philosophy. And if you're seen to have a deeply held philosophy, you have the same level of protections that people do for being a different race, meaning that people who, quote-unquote, are ethical vegans get these special protections in law. It's
this is why the protected characteristic of gender reassignment is a nonsense, because you can decide in the morning that you have it, which obviously you can't decide, oh, I'm disabled today, I'm pregnant today, I'm married today. That's objective.
I think transgender people would probably disagree.
No, but that's not what the protected characteristic is. It's, do you intend at some point in the future to change your gender? And even children have been found in law to be able to have that. So I agree, if it was that you had a GRC, that would be different, but that's not what it says.
Well, much more to come on this topic and many more here on